Welcome everyone. Welcome to today's Queen Mary University of London School of the Arts taster session. And today's taster is going to be on linguistics, a subject that many of you probably haven't really encountered at high school or secondary school. My name is Admin Chong. I will sort of do an introduction to myself a bit more later. But we also have today Sam Blackwood, who is going to introduce herself briefly. Sam's a student of ours, and I'm going to let her sort of introduce what her background is. Sam, go ahead. Go ahead.
Hi everyone, so my name is Samantha and I study Hispanic Studies and Linguistics, and I'm currently in my 4th year.
All right, so Samantha's, are you finishing up actually? Are you finishing in like a month?
Yeah, basically.
So Samantha is graduating at the end of July, so very exciting times for her. The way that today's session is going to work is we'll be talking through some material that hopefully will be of interest and that will hopefully be new. That's something that you haven't heard about before. And we will have some time at the end for questions and answer, sort of Q&A period. The way that we're going to be doing that, just because of managing sort of the people on the call, is if you have any questions, please just type it into the chat, and we will pick up on it either during the Q&A or during the actual talk itself. So feel free to, as things come up during the talk, pose a question. If I see it during the talk itself, I'll may kind of respond to it straight away. If not, we'll definitely kind of pick up on it at the end. And during the Q&A session, obviously, feel free to ask questions about what we've talked about today. But if you have any questions about linguistics as a field to myself or to Samantha as a student, or linguistics at Queen Mary, or Hispanic Studies and linguistics at Queen Mary, what sort of kinds of programs you can do, please feel free to use that opportunity to ask it at the end. So with that sort of introduction, I'm going to get going. So today we're going to talk about sort of as an introduction to linguistics, sort of this idea of how to be a language scientist, right? Just a very brief introduction to me. So my name is Adam, as I said. I'm a reader in linguistics, which is just a very fancy way of saying I teach linguistics and do research in linguistics. And I'm also the director of the phonetics lab here at Queen Mary. So this is one of the 3 main research labs in the department. Not surprisingly, given the fact that it's a phonetics lab, I specialize in the fields of phonetics and phonology. These are fields that sort of look at sound patterns in language. We're going to talk a little bit about that today, right? I also work on language acquisition, so how kids and adults acquire the languages that they speak, as well as experimental linguistics. So for those of you who come in from a psychology background, right, we'll be looking at some tools that actually you would use as a cognitive psychologist. I work in a bunch of different languages. I don't speak most of these. I just work on them, many of them. Sort of near and dear to my heart at the moment are Singapore English and Atara Imere, which is an underdocumented language spoken in Vanuatu. So the question that we're going to ask today is, well, what is linguistics, right? Sort of for most of you, you might have some sense of what it is from English language. You're doing it at A level or classics or various ways you might have fallen into linguistics. And today we're going to sort of look at some examples of how we go about investigating linguistic questions, right? We're going to just start with a very basic example. So a very basic sentence, a set of data. Here's a sentence, right? Sentence 1, they looked up the mountain. So if I ask you to sort of describe the meanings possible with this sentence, you might be able to say, okay, there are 2 things that this sentence could mean, right? The first one, A, would be that whoever they were standing at the bottom of the mountain and looking up at it. So they're literally sitting down and looking up, gazing upon its height, right? The second meaning would be something like they checked a guide, for example, about information about the mountain. So they looked up the mountain in the guidebook, right? So hopefully most of you would agree. I can't see if the thumbs up, sort of those reactions are possible at the moment, but if you can, right, hopefully you can agree that these are 2 possible readings or 2 possible meanings that you can assign to this sentence. Great. Now, what's interesting is that when these 2 meanings, when we add another word into this, so the word that we're going to be playing around with here is desperately, right? So they looked desperately up the mountain, right? So the question is whether or not both of these meanings survive, as it were, when we put this new word in, right? So what's interesting is that only one of these meanings is available. So although sentence 1 has these 2 possible meanings, when you look at sentence 2 with only just this one extra word, desperately, right? we know that this can only mean that they were standing at the bottom of their mountain looking up at it, say desperately looking for, so, the hikers or something like that, right? And the second available meaning in 1B, this doesn't work, right? Can I just get a thumbs up if this kind of conforms to your intuitions, right? Right. And so the question is why is that the case, right? So, hopefully this is like, oh, this is trivial. You might know it's like something to do with the word verb, look, and up together, right? But it's not just about having the adverb there, right? Adverb here being desperately. Because if I move desperately just one word away, they desperately looked up the mountain. What's interesting here is we actually now get both of these meanings that we had in 1A and B. They're now both available, right? Hopefully this conforms to your own intuition so far, right? So the question that we're sort of looking at here is a very simple one, right? So here you have a sentence that has two possible meanings. We minimally change this sentence by adding a word in a particular position. One of those meanings go away. We can still move that sort of word somewhere else in the sentence, but then now both of these meanings return as possible meanings, right? So the question is why, right? What is the reason for this, and how do we come up with an analysis of this sentence to allow for us to actually accurately capture these differences in meaning, right? So this is a very trivial example. We're not doing anything fancy. It's literally here are three different sentences. I've varied it minimally between each of those examples, right? Between 1 and 2, there's one difference. I've just added the word desperately. Comparing 2 and 3, I've the same words, I've just moved it around by one position, right? And so this sense of minimal comparison, right? And this is just one example and one very straightforward and sort of simple example of what the kinds of data that linguists are interested in, right? So just by way of this sort of introduction to the field, so what is linguistics, right? So linguistics is the science of human language. We're trying to understand how do we model exactly the kind of intuitions you just had about those sentences and how those intuitions change whenever you kind of fiddle around with sort of what is in those sentences, right? And we're interested in how language has developed, how it's able to create infinite kinds of new meanings, how it's learned and represented in our brains, right? More importantly, too, for some of you doing English language, you might also be learning about how language is used to shape identity and community, right? And how this might change over time, right? You might be guessing just from the kind of breadth of this that the field is highly interdisciplinary. It consists of English language and modern languages. If you do psychology and sociology, computing, data science, you can all bring these questions to bear, right, on language. And fundamentally, what we're interested in is the fact that our minds follow a bunch of unconscious rules about how we pronounce sounds in our language, how we put sentences together, but that we don't actually consciously know. So if I asked you, to describe what's exactly going on in those three sentences, you might be able to sort of vaguely talk about what's going on, but these are things you probably never thought about before, right? And as linguists, we're trying to figure out what the nature of these rules are, so and to try and understand the system, right? Language as a system. And this knowledge can consist of different things. We're going to talk about only a subset of these today, right? So phonetics and phonology, so how sounds are used to organize meaning, how words are put together, the study of morphology, how you put larger sentences together in syntax, how you create meaning, so semantics, how the brain and the mind process language through psycholinguistics, so this is the intersection of psychology and linguistics, how languages change over time, historical linguistics, as well as how people use language in everyday life. We're going to look at a snippet of some of these things today in the core of today's talk. What's also important to know is that there is not just one way to study language, right? So what we just introduced at the start of the talk was just a very simple, I asked you for your intuitions, right? Like what are they and what are those? And we can draw some very strong inferences about them. But that's not the only way we can study language, right? We can look at media. So some of you who are doing English language or English literature and language would be familiar with looking like discourse in the media, right? You might be looking at corpora, so looking at large sets of data and looking at counts of words and how often they occur with each other. You might be asking, say, people to rate accents. We're going to look at an example of this later. So this is a kind of a survey type format. And then we kind of depart sort of probably from here to things that maybe you haven't seen before. So here you have what's called a syntax tree, which is a way of we as linguists think of how we can model the structure of a sentence, right? Which kinds of words go together? How do we build a sentence up? This feels a lot more like maths, if anything. We can also use tools like ultrasound technology to look at what is actually going on when we produce words, right? This is an ultrasound tongue image, right? So some of you probably were not expecting to see like an ultrasound image today in this talk. We can record people and see and measure what they're doing in speech, right? We can also look at how their eyes are reacting. So here's a plot that looks at the dilation of people's pupils. So like, your eyes, right, when they're listening to audio or speech, right? And we can make inferences about what's going on, what we think is going on in the mind with this. And we can also look directly at the brain. So here are sort of the figure looks very similar, right? But in this case, it's actually brain activity, right? So linguistics, as you can see, sort of spans the kind of globe, as it were, right? From humanities, social sciences, but also sort of like natural sciences, right? And so there's sort of something in it for everyone, right? So in the rest of today's talk, I'm going to kind of walk you through sort of a series of examples and studies that look at speech primarily, right? Because this is what I do. I'm a speech scientist, I'm interested in speech, right? We're going to look at the social life of speech, how we can think about small sounds and how this actually has fairly large consequences, right? So diving in. So what happens when we speak and listen? So you probably haven't really thought about this in sort of gory detail, right? But when we speak and listen, what has to happen first is that, we saw the ultrasound tongue image, right? Something has to happen in our tongues. A configuration has to occur. When I'm talking now, my tongue is moving, my vocal folds are vibrating, my lips are moving to create different kinds of physical configurations. These physical configurations have consequences for the sound waves, right? Because sound waves are basically just, speech is basically just sound waves, right? And our ears have to kind of interpret this, right? So our ears basically take this in some ways and interprets it. But the way in which we actually, our minds, however, further structure what we hear, right? So what we actually think we're hearing, right, as we shall see, is not a veridical or a sort of impression of what it is that we actually comes into our ear canal, right? So a lot actually has to happen before we actually even understand what's going on, right, in terms of understanding speech, right? So when we think about speaking, right, so here are sort of our tongues again, right? We have differences in the ways in which our tongues are sort of configured. So here are different vowels, right? So when we say a vowel like E in a word like beat, our tongue root, the body of our tongue is really high. You feel free to try this at home, right? Right? If you say a word like beat, as in to beat a drum, right? If I said a word like boot, as into the boot of a car, the tongue is further back, right? And these different configurations can result in different kinds of sets of vowels. So in English, we have a set of monophthongs. So these are single vowels. Notice firstly, English has more than 5 vowels, even though we only have 5 letters, right? But they actually more than 5 actual vowels that we produce, as in speak. But this can also range to something like in Swedish, where that's something that has more vowels, right? So we have these different capabilities of producing different kinds of vowel sounds and creating different kinds of vowel categories, right? So for example, in the front area of the mouth, so you have only one high front vowel. So this is the word E, is in beat. Whereas in Swedish, you have a whole bunch of things going on, right? And so, which if you've spoken a different language, you'll know that acquiring the speech sounds of a different language can be quite difficult depending on what that is, right? So this is just as a kind of orientation, a way of representing sort of what's going on in the mouth. So where you have the front of a mouth and the back of a mouth. So E, like a word like beat, and a vowel in beat is produced at the front of a mouth. A word like boot is the vowel there is produced at the back of the mouth, and a word like say like bat, for example, is produced at the bottom of the mouth, right? So it's sort of like it's a schematization of where things are in the mouth. What's interesting is, although I'm presenting this to you as though like, oh, these are like, say, I think in English here, we can count, there are 15 categories here, right? 15 distinct vowels. When we actually sort of go in the wild, as it were, to kind of measure what's going on, we actually find that, well, really, each of these vowels is produced each time by a different speaker, right, in a very different way, right? So what you see here is actual measurements of each vowel, of different vowels. So E's are all in yellow here. So what we had before. U's, that like in boot, these are the green triangles at the back, right? And you notice that firstly, it's not like they're single points, right? And secondly, that actually there's a lot of overlap between these categories, right? So for example, ah here, which is in the kind of fuchsia, the kind of purple thing here, right, seems to have a lot of overlap with vowels in sort of the red, the kind of like darker red squares, which are O, right? So the question is, how do we, make sense of what's going on, given that this is actually what is in our environment, right? This is how people speak. What's crazy is that children are able to do this really quickly, right? They're able to go, okay, I hear all these differences, but I'm able to kind of impose the categories that I need in my native language, right? And so the question is, how does one do that, right? Um, Babies manage to group these extremely variable sounds into a set of very few categories very quickly in life, right? Within the first year of life, kids can do this, right? So the question is how, right? So we're going to spend the rest of today really talking about how these kinds of categories, right? We're going to talk about how what these categories are, how do we postulate them in the first place, how are they, how can we detect them? Sort of like, it's all well and fine that I'm telling you that English has these vowel categories, but how do we actually show that these things exist? But also show how those categories can, our interpretation of those categories can depend on a bunch of things that are actually external to the individual, right? So we'll see how that works in a second. Okay, so we're going to firstly look at, actually before that, I'm just going to, excuse me, I have to close the door. All right, apologies. Okay, before we do, the next thing we're going to do is look at, for the rest of today's talk, right, we're going to look at different kinds of examples of categories. We're going to start with English P and B, okay? So in English, the sounds P as in pat and B as in bat, right, or the vowels B, E as in beat, or the I as in bit, are considered different categories, right? Hopefully you intuitively know this, right? And we know as English speakers, intuitively, these are just different, right? You know that the P in pat and the B in bat, these are just different things. We just know this. And we call these meaningful categories in sort of technical terms, phonemes, right? Phonemes. So some of you might have heard these before, right? So the questions that we can ask here are, how do we know what these are in the languages that we speak, right? How do I know what the phonemes are in the language, right? This is one question you might ask. And where do they come from, right? Or how do we detect them, right? So one straightforward way of answering at least part of this question, which is to say, how do we know that what the phoneme categories are in the languages to speak are, is to look at distribution. So what I mean by the distribution of sounds in the language is where they occur, right? And so at a very basic level, right, if I substitute B for P, in the same position of a word, it changes the meaning, right? So for example, in English, we can come up with pairs of words like pin and bin, right? So P here and B are in the same position of the word. They start the word, right? And both of these examples only differ by that one thing, the P and B. Everything else is the same, right? So you can think about this as a very controlled experiment, right? You kept the vowel and the end the same. All I'm doing is switching out the first sound, right? I can swap it with P and B. And in this case, it changes the meaning of the word, right? So pin we know is different from bin, right? Pin is a thing you like stick sort of into a pin cushion if you're trying to sew. Bin is the thing you toss your garbage into, right? And we can show this as well that this doesn't hold just for the starts of words, right? At the ends of words, so lap versus lab, right? Again, the same idea, this idea of we're keeping everything the same except for just switching out this one thing, P versus B, in the same position, right? Again, a mini experiment, right? Because in experiments, you like to control things for the most part. So isolate the thing that we're interested in, right? And the same thing, right? Lap is different from lab. We know that what lap is, it's, you're sitting on someone's lap, right? Or my dog is sitting on my lap, for example, versus I work in a lab, right? A space where you conduct scientific experiments. So in linguistics or in phonology, so this is the realm of phonology, the study of speech sounds, these are what's called minimal pairs, right? These are words that differ in only one sound, one phone, right, in the same position of the word, and that have different meanings, right? And notice that we're not doing anything particularly fancy. We're just looking at distribution of the sound. This is very similar to what we looked at the start of the talk when we looked at these different sentences, right? We're just changing one thing to see how that actually changes our intuitions or changes the meaning, changes the behavior of someone, right? And here, this allows us to establish at least one piece of evidence that P and B are different categories in English, right? Because it changes the meaning, right? So they contrast the meaning, right? So so this is a very simple formal linguistic analysis based on the distribution of where sounds occur, right? Notice that I don't need any fancy equipment. Pen and paper will help me do this, right? Now, you might be going, okay, this is all well and fine, right? We know there's a P and B, but you've also said that like if you go back to the vowels, right, that like every single time we produce a sound, they're always going to be, they might overlap in some way, right? So one question you might ask is, where do we draw the line between these categories, right? Or put it another way, when does a P stop being a P and becomes a B, right? What are the structure of those categories in our mind, right? Is there a boundary, right? Because if I say there's a category, there are two different categories, presumably there's a point at which one thing stops being the other, and can we even tell the difference, right? And to do this, we kind of need to employ different kinds of methods, right? And so now we're kind of moving more into the kind of laboratory sciences aspect of linguistics, right? So before we kind of set up the experiment, we're going to participate in a very mini experiment in a second, right? We're going to just show you some show you some setup to kind of make it make sense. So in English, the B in bat and the P in pat differ primarily in whether there's noise before the vowel, right? So that is, if everyone at home so does this demonstration with me. So I'm going to get you all to put your hand in front of your mouth and say bat and pat, right? So hopefully what you're looking for is in the word pat, you can feel quite a bit of puff of air on your hand, right? Hopefully this makes sense, yeah? And hopefully you've all felt that as well. This is compared to bat, where maybe you do feel something, but it's definitely not as strong as in the word for pat, right? Hopefully that's all clear, yeah? But the nice thing about it is because speech is just sound waves, we can actually look at it. We can actually have a physical imprint of it and see it. So what you see here are what's called a spectrogram. So you can think about this as like a physical imprint of speech, right? I've spoken, I've recorded it, and now I can see individual speech sounds, right? Because individual speech sounds are just different frequencies, right? So bats on the left, pats on the right. And what you just felt, that little puff of air, we can see in this actual signal. So this is just to sort of show you, right? Not just kind of like doing a magician's trick, right? We can actually point to, here's the noise before the vowel ah, right? And you can see what I've done here for you is indicate where the different speech sounds are relative to this diagram, right? So the vowel's here, the P's here, right? And this little darkness bit here is the noise, right? So this is how they differ, right? So what we can ask then is how much noise is necessary for a P to be a P, right? Because in some ways, if the differences between B and P's in English are, if there's noise present, how much is necessary, right? Before I decide actually that's no longer a P, it's now a B, right? So we're going to take part in a really classic experiment. And some of you may know this, I don't know. Some of you have seen this before, right? So we're going to ask this question of like, how much noise that we've seen is necessary for P to count as a P, right? So I'm going to get you all to do this at home. If you did this in a classroom, it would be a lot more dramatic because we can see what's going on, right? But just try, stay at home and hopefully this will work in the same way. So I want you all to start by raising your hand, right? And I'm going to then play you a set of sound files, right? Oh, great. Yeah, you can all raise your hand on Teams. Perfect, right? And what I want you to do is lower your hand. So have your hand on the buzzer, as it were, right? When you think you hear, when you hear pa, right? So I'm just gonna do this, hopefully, and then I'm gonna wait for everyone to do this, right? All right, so let's do this. Ooh. All right, everyone ready? And go. Ooh. Let's try that again.
Ba. 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 Ba.
Right, so hopefully, if you could sort of see the changes in hands going, what happened was most of you started with you started your hands up, right? And you hopefully would have heard the first sound as being ba, right? Hopefully that was clear. And it's like different repetitions of it, ba 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 ba, and at some point you're like, wait, that no longer sounds like ba, it sounds like pa, right? And so what the experiment we've just done, right, is what's called a categorical perception experiment, right? So what I've done is each of those instances of ba, pa, 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 and so forth just starts with ba, and you add a little bit of noise on to that consonant, right? And at some point, right, you go from, oh, it's a ba, and all of a sudden it switches to a pa. I'm not sure, I know whether you had that experience of like the category change from a ba to a pa was pretty abrupt. That is to say, it was like it was ba 1 second, it was pa the next, right? And this is a very common sort of behavioral experiment to show that actually, yeah, we have these different categories, and that we can pinpoint as to where along, what characteristics of the speech signal, right, actually make a pa, a p, and what makes them a b. Like hopefully everyone sort of at least got that, right? So again, feel free to thumbs up to kind of like show that, yep, that makes sense, right? I felt that, to make that clear, right? So what's really interesting is that you know, if you are, I don't actually know what your language background is, right? So you may have noticed, for example, that not all of you would have made the same decision to lower your hand at the same time. Now, some of this is just noise experiments, if you know, it just has noise, right? But some of this is just due to the fact that listeners will categorize these recordings differently based on their native language. So, for example, if I'm a Spanish speaker, I might decide actually that like the category boundary for me is going to be different, right? Because the details of how P's and B's are produced in Spanish, say, are quite different from how they're produced in English. The same thing with French, right? So like different listeners will categorize these sounds differently, right? So you, for example, like waited a long time before you put your hand down, right? That might mean that may be the fact that because you speak a language where the noise that's required for a P is quite a lot more than what it is in English, right? So you might be saying, okay, well, great. So we've now shown, firstly, two things. We've shown distributionally that P and B are different sounds, right? Because we showed that they can contrast in meaning. Changing pin is different from bin, right? I can show them as a minimal pair. But also I've shown, well, Adam's not just making this up, right? In our minds, right? What we've just shown you in this experiment is that actually, yeah, there's a difference in P and B. My mind knows this, right? If I played you different sounds, I can tell that's a P and I can tell that's a B, right? And I know more or less what the boundary is between those categories, right? And you might be thinking, okay, well, at least we're hearing the same thing, right? So we're hearing the same thing and we're just judging them differently, right? So what's interesting is that like what we hear is not all that we hear. What we think we hear isn't actually always the same, right? Or it's our minds can play tricks on us, right? So this sort of what I'm kind of going to show you next, right, sort of turns this on its head a little bit, right? So what I'm going to show you now is a video. Some of you in psychology might know this, who've done psychology at A level, right? So you're gonna be seeing just a person, just the mouth, right, produce some sounds, right? And I would like you to write down the set of sounds, what words or sounds that this person is saying. I'm going to play this more than once, right? So we'll just start now. Okay.
Ba, 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 ba,
Right, I'm going to do it one more time.
ba, 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 ba.
Right. So some of these you might be like, I don't know quite what this is, but certainly you might have started with something like ba for like a B, right? And then something like a va for like a V, maybe. And then it goes something like da or something like this, right? Hopefully something along those lines, right? If you're not quite sure, I think at least the minimal thing you can probably hopefully agree on is that it sounded like the 4 or 5 things that this person has said was different, right? Hopefully thumbs up again if that makes sense more or less, or that you agree with that, right? Great. What's interesting is that, so I'm just going to play you now those exact same sounds, but without the visual cue, without the person's face.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, so a couple things. It's repeated faster, right? But what you just heard before in this, right, was actually this, right? Question. In this case here, I'm going to play it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
Do these sound the same or different? If it sounds the same, thumbs up. I'm going to play it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
Right? And that's right. So what's really crazy is that all these, what you just heard in the previous video here is actually this, right? But in the previous video, you had this percept of like, oh, it changes every single time your producer is a different, he says something, whereas here actually they're all the same, right? The only difference, again, we're minimally changing thing is whether or not the visual cue of what's going on in his mouth was there, right? So what's really interesting is that when we see a visual cue, right? So basically these are all ba, right? When we don't see the lips coming together, which is what you need for a B, right? A ba, right? Our brain basically decides like, oh, I'm going to go for the visual cue first, right? I'm going to see, my brain goes, oh, their lips are not coming together, so it can't be a ba. So I'm going to impose a different, what I think is the next best guess onto it, right? So this is a classical effect called the McGurk effect, right? You can look it up. It's a really classical finding in speech perception, right? So when you have conflicting cues, audio and visual, your brain will actually process the visual ones first, right? So this sort of hopefully what you might be getting at, you might be sort of piecing things together where like, oh, okay, now we have categories, and we've said these categories exist. But what's crazy is that, well, we can't even rely on this sort of all the time because actually sometimes, right, my brain will sort of use what I see instead to make the categorization, right? So even though technically speaking, the actual physical signal is the same, right? So a lot is going on that changes how we actually process what we're hearing. And what's interesting is that who we see. So this is sort of like what we see, right? So what do we see, like this person putting their lips together or their tongue or not? But sometimes who we see affects what you hear too, right? So so in many English varieties, right? So we're going to step away from B's and P's now, right? Looking back at vowels. There's a phenomenon called goose fronting. So this is where the vowel in goose, which is an U vowel, if any of you speak German, right, you might one of the things you might realize about the difference between English and German is that the U vowel in German is a lot further back in your mouth, right? But in many varieties of English, this U vowel is actually moving forward. So this is why it's called goose fronting. It's moving forward in the sort of mouth space, right? To something more closer to E, right? And this is primarily more prevalent amongst younger speakers, right? So that is to say, younger speakers will produce words like goose to sound more something like goose, right? Hopefully that sounds like something you are like, oh yeah, sure, that makes sense, right? And what's really interesting is, so we're looking at sort of, the categorical perception S-curve again. So again, we're looking here at difference on the vertical axis here, right? How often they said boo or B. So boo is the sort of cyan line here, which we're going to focus on, right? And the continuum sets here again, so they vary the differences between each of the kind of tokens of the vowel, right? So each repetition of the vowel differed slightly in terms of the physical properties, right? To make it more U-like or more E-like, right? And what's interesting is these sounds are exactly the same. So people listen to the same sounds, and all that the experimenters did, so this is a work with one of my PhD students, right, was all they did was show whether or not the person speaking it was an older person, or the male in this case, or a younger male, right? And what was interesting is that when they saw the younger male image, so the bottom thing, listeners, right, and so listeners would have heard both of these, right, move their boundary for where they thought the boundary between U and E further forward, right? So this is sort of the direction of the arrow, right? So the green, the cyan line here sort of crosses 50, sort of further to the left. So they sort of classified more things as E, right? In the direction of the change that younger speakers people are doing, right? And what's crazy again is that these are exactly the same physical things, right? I'm playing people the same sounds. All that's different here is whether or not they're seeing a young person speak or an old person speak, right? So again, we can hear the same thing, but who we see will actually affect how our minds structure what it is that's coming into our brain, right? So these categories, while they exist, right, the boundaries between them can actually shift depending on who we see, right, speaking, right? So a lot of this, a lot of the sort of phonological, psychological perception is socially embedded. So like how we perceive sound is socially embedded, right? So just things like, and this can be mediated by age. So just seeing a young male face can make listeners classify a sound as more ooh and not e. This gender. So just seeing a woman might make listeners classify a sound as more s and not sh. So the differences between sh and sh, the differences in ways and different genders and how these are produced. There's also race, right? Just seeing someone who is seeing an Asian face make listeners classify a voice as more accented, even though the same voice with a white or sort of like majority ethnic group face may not be classified in the same way. So they're listening to this exact same thing, and all you're seeing is just a different picture, right? So really what this shows us is that the social expectation, right, affects what we hear, right? So these categories that we started with, which are real, these are cognitive objects, right, also have a social expectation that sort of affects how we actually interpret that, right? So in the last little bit of time, we're going to look at sort of zooming out even bigger. We're going to look at a little bit on sociolinguistics, but and focusing again about how our mind structures what we hear, right? And this time looking at the flip side, right? And so this is work by one of my colleagues, Devyani Sharma. Some of you might know the work at A-level English language, right? And so this is work of hers looking at accent bias in the UK, in Britain, and looking at attitudes to different accents. So this is an experimental study, where she looked at, she and colleagues looked at how different accents are rated, right? And so this is a controlled study where they varied sort of region as well as sort of a proposed class. So you have General Northern English, which is a middle class Northern accent, versus Southern RP, or received pronunciation, which is a middle class Southern accent. Working class accents that were, again, Northern versus Southern. And within the Southern region, there was both estuary English as well as multicultural London English, which is a multi-ethnic variety, right? And so the different accents, right? We're not going to go through all the results in detail, but the key thing to say is the design of the experiment, right? So in total, right, the study design had basically, people were listening to 2 different job candidates per accent, right? And all these were male. And they were answering the same questions for the trainee position, right? So they were sort of the setup was sort of some kind of job interview for an elite occupation. This is a law firm, right? The crucial thing to say is that the content and the grammar, sort of the actual linguistic information that was being said, was exactly the same, in the sense of like, here's a passage, essentially, read it out, right? So the content and grammar were identical. And they were asked to rate, these different speakers based on competence, expertise, likelihood of success, and personal likability, right? And so this was a very large sample for a sort of this kind of survey, and it was sort of a representative sample, right? And so what they found was that that some candidates were heard as less knowledgeable, even when the answers were identical, right? So what you see here is, sort of a graph that shows the accent rate. So this is across different things, the accent rating from a 0 to a 7-point scale, right? And on the horizontal axis is the age of the person rating the accent, right? So what you notice is, firstly, that actually at the younger age, there really isn't much difference as to how these different accents are being rated, right? But sort of once the listeners get older, right, the ways in which these accents are rated differs, right? You can see, firstly, actually, like overall things go down, right, with age. But what we notice is that, very specifically, that there is a bias against working class London voices, right? So both estuary English, which is the kind of like brownish line, right, and multicultural London English, which is the kind of darker green line here, are rated lower. I mean, this is relatively speaking, right, than the other accents, right? But primarily by older speakers, right? People who are sort of the older you get, right? So there's more above age 45. It's more biased if you're from the south of England and the higher social classes, right? And there's also intersectional bias, where it does get rid of accent strength penalty for Black speakers versus Northern, right? So there's a lot going on in this data set. This work is not published and it's in the public domain. Feel free to look at it if you're more interested in it. But what I kind of wanted to show you here is actually the reverse of the McGurk effect. So where in the McGurk effect we saw was that what we see affects what we hear, right? This is kind of it's almost like the reverse. The accent we hear, we sort of draw inferences about that, which affects our social expectation. Because the task that they're using here was a social sort of a social ratings task, right? You're rating someone based on their competence, expertise, and likelihood of success, and so forth, right? And here, all that's different is the actual accent that they're speaking. And hopefully, and this might not be a surprise to you, right? But this sort of just goes to show, right, that uh, what we hear, a lot is going on, right, when we're just listening to speech, right? What's also really interesting is that the accent bias was reduced with expert content and also confident style. So these are things. What's interesting about this study is, and this set of work is that these biases are not sort of insurmountable, right? There are ways in which people can address, sort of actually concretely address this, right? And Sharma and colleagues have encouraged aspiring professionals to actually focus on the kind of knowledge and confidence aspect and not actually suppressing accent. Because if you sort of saw a graph like this, you might, one thing, you might hear people say, don't talk like that because like, people will think about you in a different way, right? Whereas Sharma and colleagues are saying, well, actually what they need to focus on is actually knowledge and projecting confidence. It's not really about focusing on suppressing the accent, right? Because, accent's identity, right? That's sort of like you're basically hiding your identity when we don't want that to happen, right? That's not an authentic self-representation, right? And from this, Sharma and colleagues have sort of created sort of interactive tutorials for actually looking at how we can raise awareness of these kinds of accent bias things, right? Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, right? So what we've seen today is sort of a snippet of looking at how linguists go about thinking through problems, right? So we started with a really pen and paper type example, looking at a sentence. And then we started looking at how different sound categories emerge, right? How do we think about these different sound categories, both from a kind of distributional perspective, but also what's going on in our minds, right? And we also then looked at how, these sounds, how our minds sort of hear these sounds, right? How we actually categorize them, right? And how actually social biases, just in terms of who we're seeing, as well as what we're seeing just facially, right, can actually change the way we hear the same thing, right? So this is sort of looking at psychology. And what we haven't really talked about as much is sort of where this comes from, so different waves of changes in social media, so this is to do with history. But how this actually then signals attitudes and identity, so personal styles and attitudes. So the last thing about different accents and the attitudes towards these accents, or in sociolinguistics, right? And how then this can affect how we hear things, right? The attitudes that we have towards a particular speech style, a speech accent, can actually affect how we actually interpret what is being said, right? So what this hopefully shows is that, well, we can talk about things sort of from a fairly cognitive perspective, right? Psychology and history are also always very socially driven, right? So hopefully this gives you a really sort of expansive view of what linguistics is as a field, right? If you're interested in looking at some of these, right, this is a very tiny fraction. So what we've seen today is just a small set of the things that linguists are interested in. So phonetics and phonology, so looking at sounds, how the mind processes languages, so psycholinguistics, as well as how people use this on a day-to-day basis, so sociolinguistics, right? There's a ton of things that we haven't covered today, not surprisingly, that also can intersect with these things that we've talked about, right? So one of the things what I wanted to sort of talk about, sort of raise in this talk, and then we'll sort of wrap up briefly, is how we actually, as linguists, go about uncovering the rules. And this can be also social rules, right? So how our mind structures the social information, right? And there are tons of things you can do, right? People can record or do surveys of people on the real world to look at accents, as Sharma and colleagues have done. You can work with native speakers as scientists to figure out like how human languages work. So looking at, getting people to produce things and understanding the distribution of those data. Also use experiments, which is sort of what we focus mostly on today, to probe how we perceive and produce language in real time, right? And fundamentals of all these different ways of looking at language is really what we're looking for is patterns, right? We're looking for patterns in the data, right? To tell us about what's going on in our minds and how our minds are dealing with the language that we're actually hearing and producing, right? Okay, so just a kind of two quick things is sort of to wrap out, right? So why linguistics, right? So hopefully what if you're thinking about pursuing linguistics at university, right? Hopefully what I've succeeded in sort of showing you at least is the fact that linguistics is a really diverse field, right? and because of its diverse field, it's sort of really unusual in equipping students a really diverse set of skills, right? It combines methods and insights from the sciences, so like STEM, basically, so it's like like psychology, but also like neuroscience in some cases, the social sciences as well as humanities, right? And you really and you can kind of span sort of the humanities to the sort of natural sciences, depending on the kinds of things you do, right? And because all our work deals with humans, right, actual humans, right, and understanding human behavior and communication, this really means that we sort of can address some really interesting questions, but with sensitivity to sort of language and diverse communities as well, right? And our graduates go on to, and this is obviously at Queen Mary, but also elsewhere, right, to a wide range of different careers. So these are just some examples of what the kinds of things that people do, right? A lot of times people wonder what do you do with linguistics, right? Not everyone becomes a linguistics professor. Fair enough. That's totally fair, right? So what do people go into, right? So a lot of students go into education. That's not surprising. A lot of our students become English teachers, foreign language teachers. But many of our students also go into the information and technology sector, the tech sector, looking at speech recognition, data engineering, and data science, if you're more quantitatively inclined. A number of our students have gone to finance, right, who have worked at Goldman Sachs and so forth. Again, you might not have thought about that as a possibility, right? But many have also increasingly gone to speech and language therapy. So this is sort of a clinical degree that requires sort of a further training, right? So lots of different things, and it's really because of the big skill set that we offer students in the ways you can think about linguistic data, right? So we're just going to sort of end there, and then hopefully open the floor to questions. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully you've learned something new and you found it interesting, and we will open the floor to questions. If there are any questions, please just pop it in the chat. And I should say these are questions for both. I'm gonna go back to this part, right? Hopefully, feel free to ask either Samantha or me about both the concept of talk, but also about what it's like to be a student as an undergrad in linguistics here at Queen Mary. So Chelsea just asked what the slide was before diverse careers, so I've just tried to show the kind of skill set slide that was before that. Yeah, hopefully that was what you were looking for, Chelsea. Yeah. Yeah, any questions, just pop it into the chat, please, for either of us. So Amani, thanks very much for your question. So the question, just in case people didn't see it, is will we get to do any of our own research at undergraduate level, or is it only a postgraduate thing? So I can let Samantha sort of speak to that in a second, but what I can say is one of the strengths of our program, at least, is firstly, all our students do a final year, at least in the single honors degree, and it's optional for the joint students. Let's say modern languages and linguistics students, for example, like Samantha. But all our single honors linguistics or English language and linguistics students do a final year research project. And this is a self-guided research project that is supervised by a member academic staff on a topic of their choice. I'm wondering actually if I have, let me see if I have examples of, yeah, so I'm just going to show you some examples. So here's just this is a very small snippet of examples of undergraduate research projects that our students have done in the past. So you see it's actually quite a wide range. So we have, looking at rap, for example, looking at how that affects stuttering. So this is a more clinical thing. Lexical retrieval, which is more of a psycholinguistics thing, and so forth. So yes, for sure. But before that, a lot of our students also do smaller projects in different classes at the sort of on a smaller scale. And one of the things that is that we emphasize is actually research methods training at the sort of as a core part of the degree. So in the single honors degrees, I'm not sure if I have this here. I don't. Oh, sorry, that just went back out. Go back to sharing my screen again. Right. This is reflects the old program. That's fine. When we at level 5, so the second year, all our students have to work do 2 modules now on qualitative and quantitative research, right? So we really try to build research into the program, whether or not you actually want to become an academic researcher or not, because we believe that there's a lot to be gained by research skills, right? You can apply that to many different kinds of things. Samantha, do you have anything to add from your experience as a student on undergraduate research?
So I actually didn't do the dissertation
Yeah.
this year, but I would second to what you say about us like working on sort of mini projects. I've done the same thing throughout my degree, whether it be for sort of the final project, collecting my own data. I remember in first year, I did the module and I had to look at a language that didn't have a dictionary. So I picked Malayalam that my friend spoke. She was a native speaker. And that in itself was me sort of transcribing a language, from scratch. I think that was really cool, really interesting. So you definitely do get those opportunities throughout your degree.
Yeah, and I think that Samantha raises a big point. So we tend to get students to collect their own data in some way, shape, or form, in some small piece even, right? Like from the get-go, right? So from the first semester of the first year, students are getting more acquainted and comfortable with how would I like work with linguistic data? What kind of data would I need? That kind of stuff. Even if it's as Samantha was saying, like I'm just transcribing some words, right, of this language, that a lot goes into thinking through that process and then using that to understand, what the analysis might be, right? And so there's different kinds of research that happen on different scales throughout the entire program. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Other questions? So the questions are, I guess, what the three general topics you study at linguistics at university are. I mean, we in our program at least, we if we go back to where it is, this right, this slide here. One of the strengths of our program here at least at Queen Mary, and I can't speak for other universities, is that actually our students are trained or across all of these. So in the first year of the program, you do a class in each of these areas, right? Because we believe it's important to understand that we believe it's important for you to understand like sort of all the different components. Whether you specialize in them is a different story, right? But as a kind of basic foundational knowledge, all our students will basically look at all these different sub areas in linguistics, right? In their first year at least. And then students then have a lot more choice to decide which ones they want to pursue from that in the second and third year. Yeah. So Sophia asks, is there quite a lot of research methods of statistical analysis? So, okay, so I'm going to differentiate those two because research methods does not have to be quantitative, right? So is there a lot of research methods? Yes, in the sense of because of the fact that our students do research on different ways and different sizes, right? In some way, shape, or form, it's embedded throughout the program, right? Now, that doesn't have to be statistical in nature, right? So if you're doing a formal analysis of a language, that is to say you're just coming out with an analysis of, say, how the verb system works in a language, that is almost entirely qualitative. So that does not involve any stats whatsoever. We do have a thread in our program that does emphasize more quantitative data or quantitative analysis. And so this involves like using experimental work, or you're working with surveys and so forth. And so you do get training in that in one module, right? So there's a quantitative research methods module in the second year that students do have to take. But you don't have to kind of, partly, depending on what it is you decide you want to specialize in, you may not actually use quantitative methods for your final year project, right? But it's still important in many ways to understand, just from as in some ways as a general education perspective, right? That how to think quantitatively, right? Hopefully, Sophia, that answers the question, right? Yeah, great. But there are sort of, I guess the hopefully the thread is you get core training, but you don't have to specialize in all of this, right? Yeah, I mean, so unfortunately there isn't really like a law with linguistics program, not at Queen Mary, and I'm pretty sure that not in many places, anywhere that we know of. A lot of our students, a number of our students do go on to law at a postgraduate level. So they do a 3-year linguistics undergraduate degree first, and then they go on to do a law degree. There's a lot of intersectionality now between linguistics and the law. In fact, we have a module on that with looking at language and the law, right? But unfortunately, for various reasons, right, it's hard to have a degree with law and linguistics because of what's required on the law side of things, unfortunately. Yeah. It's not actually a random mix, so don't feel like it is. It's just that joint programs sometimes can be quite difficult in that way. But students have gone on to postgraduate law degrees from our program in the past. Any other questions? Any questions for Sam, Samantha, about being a student, or doing joint honors in a modern language and linguistics, potentially, how that works? No? Okay, great. I mean, if there are any questions at all, if you sort of go away and go, oh, I wanted to ask a question, I just forgot. Please feel free to get in touch with the School of the Arts team. So I think however you signed up for. Oh yeah, okay, good question. Polly asked, is there a yearbook required for joint honors? Samantha, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, it is a requirement for joint honors with MFL, but I will say they're quite flexible with it in terms of what you can do, and how long you can be out there as well. The minimum is 6 months, maximum is 15, so you don't actually have to be out there for the whole year. There are cases where people don't go. If you're a native speaker, they have a committee for the year abroad, so there is an option to not go if there are sort of extenuating circumstances, or like you're a native, there's an option to sort of skip it. But in general, everyone goes, everyone's happy to go as well. It's sort of the most like, I don't want to say exciting, but it's sort of the most like thing that people look forward to when they do like joint honors languages and anything else. So yeah.
And it's, what Samantha says is really, I think, important. Like the fact is that there's quite a lot of flexibility of what you do in the year that you're away. So I know of students who've spent half the year doing like a work placement in a foreign, like, say in Spain, and then the other half of the year, because it's a year, right, in an actual university, right, or the full year as a work placement, right? Samantha, I think there's quite a lot of flexibility about how you actually do that. Right. So Jessica asked, do modern languages and linguistics complement each other very well? I mean, I'm going to, from the academic side, say yes, absolutely. I mean, those two things are inherently linked, right? Especially if you're, if anything, at least from my own personal experience, understanding linguistics has helped me learn or think about how I approach studying a modern language, right? Samantha, since you've done the program and now I'm finishing, you can maybe speak more to that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think it's like one of the best combinations you can do. I think as well, you also like do linguistics in that subject, like in your first year. Like I did Spanish linguistics, for example, and it makes the difference, I think, in your understanding of that language. And as you said, like as you go on to learn new languages, like your approach to learning that language will be different because you will have that sort of different understanding of it. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. But good question. I mean, it's a common pairing, right? And so the question is, why do people do it, right? And the reason is exactly that, that's as Samantha's outlined. Any other questions? Amani asks, what is the general pathway for becoming a linguistics professor after completing undergrad degree? Okay, I will take that one. Typically, well, you need a PhD, right? So you need a doctoral research project. And so the way that it typically works is that students will either, if you're staying in the UK or in Europe, then students would go on to do a master's program that has more advanced level study and research. In fact, more advanced research in linguistics before pursuing a more larger scale, multi-year independent research project that will form part of a PhD program. So typically, if you go straight through, and some people do, you are looking at after your undergraduate degree between 5 to 6 extra years of university education, but it changes a lot. Once you're a PhD student, you're no longer really a student as such. You're working in many ways, right? It's very different. If you decide to go to the United States, for example, they have a slightly different model there where you apply directly into a PhD program, but those PhD programs are 5 years long, 6 years long, but they include a master's along the way, right? So, but either way, basically, the end goal is you need a PhD in order to actually become an academic in that sense. Yeah. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. Other questions? So in joint honors between, so Sophia asked, in joint honors between modern languages and linguistics, do you do all the models for linguistics? So I guess if you're asking about the kind of required classes uh, for a joint program, so the way it typically works is that people tend to split things 50-50. So like, for example, an entire year, you have well, 120 credits, right? Which is usually equates to like 8 classes, as it were. And most students will basically do 4 of those in the modern language and 4 of them in linguistics, right? In the first year, in linguistics, we require you to do 2 specific core classes. And then the rest of it is kind of electives. It's sort of up to you to decide what set of things you want to do, right? So there's quite a bit of flexibility in that sense, right? And you can also choose to depending to have a slight weighting towards one of the other. Like we're talking about like one extra module in linguistics or one extra module in like the modern language, right? So there's a little bit of flexibility with that, both in terms of selection of what modules you might want to do, as well as what the relative weighting of them are. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah. Okay, so it's coming to 5 past. One more question if anyone has a final question. Okay, so I think we're up. If, again, as I said, if anyone has a question that they haven't asked yet and would like to ask, and forgets to, feel free to get in touch with the School of the Arts team, and their email was probably out when you first signed up to this session, and then they will forward that on to, if they can't answer it, then they will forward it on to someone who can, right? But hopefully you found it interesting and you learned something. If you decide you don't want to do linguistics, that's fine. Like, I mean, that's not for everyone. This is for you to like get a taster of it, right? But at the very least, hopefully you learned something new today. And with that, I will bid you all a lovely evening and keep cool and drink lots of fluids in the sun. And hopefully, for those of you who are doing A levels, good luck with the exams and so forth. If not, good luck for the rest of the academic year. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.